Metroid Samus Returns feels like a forgotten installment of the Metroid franchise here in 2023. It's strange to think that this game was released only about 6 years ago in 2017. It just feels like so much longer. No one ever seems to talk much about this game, even when the Metroid franchise occasionally makes headlines. Well, why is that? What happened to this game? In this retrospective, we'll first explore the unusual circumstances surrounding this game's release that may have caused it to fade into obscurity, and examine whether Samus Returns is secretly a buried treasure or just a forgettable misfire, and finally assess how that experience holds up today. Please remember to hit subscribe to support the channel. More classic Metroid content is on the way, and let's dive in. In early 2023, the release of Metroid Prime Remastered reinvigorated my decades-long appreciation for the Metroid series. So now I'm revisiting every entry in the franchise to share my thoughts and see how these games hold up. And luckily, I still own my awkward but trusty Nintendo 3DS. See, if you want to play Samus Returns in 2023, there are some barriers to entry. You must own a 3DS, which launched over 12 years ago now, and that means you also have to tolerate a dated mobile hardware experience, especially if you're using an original model, which infamously only had a microscopic 3.5-inch screen. I strongly recommend finding a 3DS XL if you can, which at least bumps the display up to a serviceable 4.8 inches. Metroid fans who move past these barriers will discover a surprisingly expansive and traditional Metroid experience. However, Samus Returns is also surprisingly one of the Metroid games I feel most conflicted about. More on that later. First, let's analyze some external factors that may have accelerated the game's fade into obscurity beyond the fact that it's a remake of the already limited audience original Game Boy game Metroid 2 Return of Samus from 1991. Samus Returns launched in the fall of 2017 under unusual circumstances and awkward market conditions. The game was developed by Mercury Steam, a third-party team who collaborated with Nintendo on the title and would also later go on to create Metroid Dread. Now, it's easy to forget that Samus Returns actually released around 6 months after the Nintendo Switch was already out, at a time when Nintendo claimed they would continue to support both platforms. Remember that? Well, the dual support was short-lived, and by 2018 the 3DS was basically on life support thanks in part to the strong reception of the Switch and the consolidation of Nintendo development teams behind one platform. The Switch was technically a competing handheld from Nintendo, so it's interesting to think that Nintendo released a major first-party franchise 6 months after a pseudo-replacement system was already on the market. Usually Nintendo converts these transitional titles to be cross-platform, yet sadly to this day, Samus Returns remains playable only on the 3DS. The exclusivity is probably due to the dual-screen nature of the game and unique 3DS hardware, though with enough effort it could probably be reworked to a single-screen experience like other classic Metroids. Samus Returns is already a remake, so it'll be interesting to see if we get some type of remaster for this remake in the future. Now this platform exclusivity matters because the 3DS never reached the sales or cultural impact of the original DS, with lifetime sales ending up at around 75 million after a troubled start, or about half of the original DS. The system was also somewhat underpowered even at launch, with graphical output roughly somewhere around a PS2 or GameCube, maybe a bit less for the original hardware model, and by late 2017 it definitely felt dated, despite a very strong library of games by the end of its run. Mobile technology advanced enormously in the 2010s. Competing phone hardware, the niche but cutting-edge PlayStation Vita, and of course the debut of the Switch caused the 3DS to age faster than most console generations from a hardware perspective. The fad of 3D movies and TVs had also largely died out by this point, and even Nintendo sort of abandoned the 3DS's key feature halfway through the system's life cycle with the launch of the cheaper 2DS. This fading relevancy of the 3DS is reflected in Samus Returns' sales numbers, which supposedly capped out at around 500,000, not great for a major first-party franchise on a system with 75 million users. Samus Returns definitely deserves more players, but sadly the 3DS was already in the background of the industry when this game released. Beyond disappointing sales numbers, the years since Samus Returns launched have also accelerated this game's fade into obscurity. Handheld gaming in general has experienced something of a renaissance in the last several years, thanks to various iterations of the Switch, the Steam Deck, and similar handheld PCs, endless phone accessories, as well as remote play and cloud streaming on platforms like xCloud, handheld technology continued to progress even more rapidly after the era of the 3DS. For this reason, whenever I revisit my 3DS, it can be jarring how dated and old the system feels overall, with its plasticky clamshell design, very small and low resolution screens, primitive audio, rudimentary online capabilities, and so on. I love the software library on the system, but the hardware has not aged well. For example, I think the original PSP from 2005 actually feels more modern than the 3DS does, which released 6 years later, but I digress. Anyway, so how does all of this impact the game itself? Well, on paper, Samus Returns is actually a surprisingly traditional Metroid experience. In fact, highly traditional. Unlike the other more experimental Metroid games that released closest to that time period, such as Federation Force, Other M, or even Metroid Prime 3, Samus Returns sticks to classic Metroid structure like glue. There isn't much in the way of cinematic storytelling, spin-off side characters, or motion controls. It's just classic Metroid Labyrinth gameplay filled with power-ups, boss fights, puzzles, and exploration, and for the most part it all plays really well, aside from the standard 3DS hand cramps. At the time, this classic design appropriately filled a very long void of 2D Metroids, even if it was a remake. Samus Returns plays it safe, but there's a reason this formula has its own gaming subgenre named after it. It just works. Now there is one pseudo-gimmick here in the form of the stereoscopic 3D visuals, but this feature can be easily turned off with no impact on the gameplay. I personally hate 3D movies and games, regardless of whether they require glasses, and I pretty much always kept this setting off on my 3DS. The display was notoriously finicky, meaning unless you held your hands perfectly still and stared straight on, the 3D effect would shimmer and not work right, which was too annoying for me personally to bother with long playing sessions. However, I will say the 3D depth is a cool or interesting effect in small doses in this game, so I would occasionally toggle it on to see the effect in new areas. I think the 3D also adds some much needed visual pop to some of the game's environments, but more on that later. Weirdly, even though it's a 2D side-scroller, this was probably my favorite implementation of 3D on the system. Samus Returns also provides less guidance than some other Metroid games, a sharp contrast from the hand-holding of Metroid Fusion or Prime 3, for example. For the most part, the game simply leaves you to explore its surprisingly vast map and figure things out yourself, which purist Metroid fans will undoubtedly enjoy, though there is a very minimalist hint system if you get stuck. As a side note, I also love that the second screen on the 3DS constantly shows you the map, which reduces the need to constantly pause and look at where you're going, super helpful in this labyrinth-style game on a small screen. The maps in this game are much more complicated than in others like Fusion or Zero Mission. Personally, I appreciated this hands-off design for the most part, but I do wish the remake sprinkled in more story bits throughout the adventure to add a bit more thematic depth and break up the somewhat grinding pace. This classic labyrinth-style structure lends itself well to the main objective of the game, which is to track down 40 Metroids and eliminate them from different regions of the planet. Once you've defeated all 40, plus a few other boss fights and final segments, you win the game. It's basically that simple. As you defeat the Metroids, new areas are unlocked and the process continues. These Metroids come in different varieties of increasing difficulty and aggression, but this is one design aspect that can start to feel repetitive after a while. Many Metroids are essentially duplicates of each other, and there aren't that many other high-level objectives. During many of these fights, the Metroids will also run away to a different room and you'll have to go track them down again, which adds to the tedium. More variety in the boss fights would have been appreciated. In fact, there's actually very little enemy variety in this game in general. For the most part, different areas just have slightly different versions of the same handful of enemies. Perhaps the most significant new gameplay feature of Samus Returns is the addition of melee combat. Samus can counter charging enemies by bashing them with her arm cannon, a system that was later refined in Metroid Dread. I think this system works well, even if the game over-relies on it to some extent. It can be a bit frustrating when multiple enemies are all charging you at the same time on a ledge and continue to bash into you when you're trying to get away or set up another counter. Samus is slower and less nimble in this game than in Metroid Dread, which is why I think the system works better in Dread, but overall, I like the mechanic in moderation, and I'm glad it's here. Aside from this melee system, most of the upgrades are traditional but fun Metroid-style power-ups, different beams, missiles, morph ball abilities, etc. The game has a slow start the first few hours, but once you really start collecting power-ups, the fun factor increases. Samus Returns also introduced the Aeon system, which enables powerful moves that use up an Aeon energy bar that you can replenish by fighting enemies. Aeon abilities allow you to boost your shields, rapid fire your beam weapons, detect hidden areas, and so on. I like this system, and I was glad to see it sort of carried over into Metroid Dread. Now, if all of this sounds like classic Metroid, that's because Samus Returns is very formulaic Metroid, maybe even to a fault. Yes, this is where I have to discuss one of the more controversial reasons I think Samus Returns has faded into obscurity a bit. Although Samus Returns is a high quality experience, it lacks a memorable personality or special hook to elevate it to true classic status like Super Metroid or Metroid Prime. I think this lack of personality stems primarily from the environments and overall presentation or thematic elements of the game. In my opinion, Samus Returns unfortunately has some of the more generic environments in the series. The different regions of the planet certainly don't look bad, I just don't find them to be as memorable as other entries in the franchise. Environments can feel a bit bland or forgettable, composed mostly of generic rocky surfaces and backgrounds, flat ledges, often painted with muted colors and lacking in strong atmosphere. The audio delivers appropriate ambiance, but lacks the iconic melodies of the other games. These regions don't even have names, they're literally just called Areas 1 through 8, and the areas in the first half of the game in particular all kind of look similar to one another, with different shades of rocky surfaces, mostly static environments or backgrounds, and repeat enemies. Individual rooms and areas all look sort of the same as one another, making it difficult to remember where you're going or where things are located. Things do improve a bit in the last few regions. In particular, the only organic region of the game is noticeably the most interesting, but it takes a while to get there. The structure of the game also amplifies this problem. Samus Returns is a reasonably long adventure, especially for a handheld game. In fact, maybe about twice as long as other entries like Fusion or Zero Mission, but there's very limited required backtracking to previously completed regions. In most cases, you unlock an area, find all of the Metroids and power-ups in it, and then move on to the next region. That means, in some scenarios, you can spend almost an hour in one region, and if that region happens to be visually uninteresting and you're just trekking around rocks looking for Metroids, that's when the experience can start to feel like a grind. Samus Returns is arguably the most slow-paced out of any 2D Metroid because of this, and that lack of urgency or momentum I think is a big contributor to the lack of personality. Environment variety and atmosphere is crucial in these games because Metroid is essentially an exploration series. The best entries have you trekking between sunken frigate ships to discover secrets, exploring underwater caves or bogs, wandering icy cliffs or futuristic temples, fleeing exploding ships in space, but Samus Returns doesn't always capture that sense of wonder or intrigue. The zones in this game aren't as memorable as anything like Brinstar or Norfair, the Chozo Ruins, Vendrana Drifts, or Sanctuary Fortress from the Prime Trilogy, or even some of the regions from Mercury Steam's own Metroid Dread. Even though a couple of the later environments are a little more alive or colorful, overall there's a lot of running and jumping through similar looking rocky areas without any standout visual themes or aesthetics. Another contributing factor to the moderate blandness is the polygonal art style choice paired with the limitations of the 3DS hardware. Samus, the enemies, environments, they're all true 3D polygons and assets rather than sprite-based like all the other side-scrolling Metroids before it. Personally, I actually really like the decision to go with a real 3D polygon style, and I think in Metroid Dread it looks beautiful. However, I think Samus Returns ends up looking a little bit blurry or washed out on the mediocre 3DS screens. The ancient hardware for 2017 limited the amount of detail in the environments. The color palette in some areas is also a bit strange or muted, with low contrast or a weird yellowy tinge in a lot of areas. I think Mercury Steam did a decent job given what they had to work with, but unfortunately Samus Returns falls into sort of an awkward graphical window in between that classic retro look and newer full 3D polygonal side-scrollers. For comparison, Metroid Fusion and Zero Mission, which came out almost 15 years earlier than Samus Returns, look more timeless in my opinion due to their vivid pixel sprite art style, simple but fun mechanics, and moody environments. They're great examples of how art style and design choices can transcend time to turn a game into a classic instead of just a dated experience. Finally, aside from the melee combat, Samus Returns doesn't really have a unique gameplay hook or story pretense. For example, Metroid Fusion had the X-Parasite to cause chaos or interesting scenarios throughout the game. Metroid Dread had the Emmy chases, brutal boss fights, and a compelling Chozo rivalry. Metroid Prime was the first 3D Metroid. Metroid Prime 2 had the highly controversial Dark and Light world, while Metroid Prime 3 had motion controls and planet hopping, and Super Metroid was an enormous step up from the original and featured beautiful sprite work and moody story beats, even on extremely limited hardware. Even Metroid Other M, while certainly not a great Metroid game by almost any measure, was full of unique and, let's say, adventurous ideas. Samus Returns ends up just feeling a little bit generic or safe to me without any sort of memorable gameplay or story hook to help it stand apart. And I think it's that lack of memorable moments or atmosphere, combined with the unfortunate timing and hardware situation of its release, that caused this game to rapidly fade into the background, even within the franchise itself. Now, I do want to reiterate that I think everything about Metroid Samus Returns is fine and often quite good. There's almost nothing bad about it. I know some of my critique sounds harsh, but I did enjoy playing through this game even if it didn't quite capture my interest like other entries, and there are not as many memorable moments of greatness. While revisiting Fusion, Zero Mission, and Dread, those 2D side-scrollers just felt like they moved along at an aggressive clip across changing, interesting environments. I kept wanting to play more and immediately wanted to jump in for a second run when I first beat them. On the other hand, revisiting Samus Returns felt like an enjoyable but slower grind without the same sense of urgency or motivation to start another run in the future. Now, if you're a hardcore Metroid fan, I would certainly still recommend playing Samus Returns if you haven't already. Personally, I think Mercury Steam's recent Metroid Dread is the superior game, but if you've already played that and you're looking for a void to fill while we wait for the next entry, Samus Returns is a classic, well-made Metroid game that any fan will still find enjoyment in. I'm not sure that I would recommend going out and spending a couple $100s to acquire a 3DS XL just for this game, but if you can find a cheap one or have access to the system somehow, this is certainly worth a playthrough. So what did you think of this game? I'm really interested to see your comments because I feel so conflicted about it. It's a great title, but it also just doesn't feel as exciting to me as other entries. Did the classic, straightforward design appeal to you, or did you also find the experience a little bit lifeless? Is this game a buried treasure or a mostly forgettable remake? I think it's caught somewhere in the middle or has elements of both, and that wasn't enough to keep it fresh in people's minds after the 3DS had faded. Please leave a comment and let's discuss, and hit subscribe to support the channel for future Metroid content.